The minimum wage bill is the bone of contention between the Nigeria Labour Congress and the National Assembly. The bill seeks to transfer the minimum wage from the exclusive list to concurrent list at the National Assembly, and this is meant to decentralize minimum wage negotiation. According to the labor union, if the bill is passed, it will return workers to the era of slavery. Managing editor, the Avalon Daily, Ayodele Adio, joins me via Skype to discuss this. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I wonder what your reaction to this bill is, because this bill has generated divergent reactions in the populace, amongst the populace rather, and the NLC is saying that this will return, this will somewhat enslave workers. I wonder if you see it that way or differently.
The reality is this. I do not buy the argument that the minimum wage should be transferred to states, primarily because we have seen how several governors have handled the wages of workers in their state, at least over the last 20 years. You have some states that are essentially rich, oil-rich states, for instance, that have owed salaries for up to 6, 7, 8 months, that have refused to even pay pensions for people who have served the state government for close to 35 years. So if you follow that trajectory, I would argue that if we make the mistake of allowing state governors to decide what the minimum wage is supposed to be, then we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot. I can assure you that many governors will have to peg that minimum wage at even lower than 15,000 if you'd allow them to do that. Essentially shortchanging a lot of workers across the country. And in essence, what are we even arguing in the first place? The 30,000 minimum wage currently being paid is not even a living wage. I mean, it can't take workers home. They can't sustain their families on it. It's completely being eroded by inflation. As we speak today, inflation is close to 17%. Food inflation alone is close to 21%. In the last 7 years, the rising inflation has eaten away the purchasing power of the average Nigerian worker by close to 50%. So what argument are we making here? Rather than have the debate about making the minimum wage catch pace with the rate of inflation and the rate of productivity in the country, we're debating whether to transfer this minimum wage to states, knowing so well that many governors will drastically reduce that amount of wage and fail to pay those wages in many cases. So my argument is not, as it were, ideological. My argument here is pragmatic, because the reality on ground is if we make that mistake to move this minimum wage to states, we're going to have a serious problem where we would have workers in many states in the country who will struggle to survive because they will earn incomes that cannot sustain themselves or their families, that lacks essentially reasonable purchasing power, and they're just going to wallow in absolute poverty.
In fact, you would recall, Ayodele, that when the minimum wage was increased to 30,000 naira, and even before then when it was 18,000 naira, we saw the reaction from some state governors saying that they didn't have the capacity to actually pay this monies, and so that is what a lot of persons are also reacting to. But for the Senate, they are saying that this is a move they want to ensure federalism with regards to this issue of minimum wage, where states own the minimum wage. But then the question is, can states really handle this when they do not even control their resources? How can they handle it?
It's interesting that the argument about federalism is being centered across, or being centered around this minimum wage debate. In most federal countries, that we like to copy or tout, most of these countries have a national minimum wage. And what states essentially do is see how they can pay above those minimum wage to either attract the best workers to their own bureaucracy and what have you. So you essentially have a standard like you have in the United States. You have a standard national minimum wage, and states can decide to either pay above that minimum wage, or keep it, at the national minimum wage, or the national benchmark that has been set. So it's funny that we want to talk federalism now, and the arguments that we're making to take power to the state is to essentially decentralize minimum wage, when there are more pertinent issues that require the decentralization of powers, and I would argue insecurity and whatever, but that's a debate for another day. The argument or the idea that governors cannot afford this minimum wage, again, it's another insincere argument, because I would argue again that many states have not been frugal with the resources that they have. Many states have not been frugal with the resources they have. You cannot tell me that states that are embarking on white elephant projects, some of whom are spending billions to build airports that they do not need, that are spending billions to build stadiums that they do not need, that they are spending billions on buying SUVs for their advisors, for their personal assistants, for their aides, and for their party faithfuls, cannot afford a 30,000 naira minimum wage. I choose to disagree with that. Listen, there's always money for what our elected officials want to use money for. And I think that it's an insult to the Nigerian people to look them in the face and tell them that they do not deserve 30,000 naira, especially at a time, like I'd argued earlier, that inflation has eroded the value of this money anyway. Their purchasing power has been beaten to the ground. It's completely dwindled. They can't survive on 30,000 naira. And here we are trying again to beat that down to maybe 18,000 naira or even lower. So I don't buy that argument. What needs to happen is that state governors need to be a lot more prudent with the resources that they have and prioritize their spending. You need state houses of assembly to ensure that their appropriation processes prioritize the most important things to their citizens or the indigents of those states. You can't be appropriating monies to white elephant projects when you have not paid salaries. There are oil-rich states as we speak today that are owing salaries, that are owing pension. Is that because of lack of resources? It's more about the irresponsibility or how they have managed the resources in their states. So when we see better management of resources, when we see better application of resources in these states, then we're going to see that more states can even work, and not this laid-back attitude that most governors usually have to say, oh, we cannot do this. And that's the same argument that they make with insecurity. Oh, we don't control the police. Oh, we don't do this. We can't continue to kick the can down the road and take this very laissez-faire attitude with most of the things that concerned indigents of various states. So I don't think that the governors are being sincere with this. They can pay that minimum wage if they are more frugal with their resources, and if they distribute their resources in a more efficient way.
Now, this has passed a second reading, and the NLC is threatening to down tools, although the Senate is appealing to them not to do so. But then, if this pulls through, what scenarios do you see playing out?
You saw the numbers. I think the NBS just released some numbers yesterday, 2 days ago, was it?
Yes.
And you saw that youth unemployment was hovering over 42%. You saw that the general unemployment in the country was about 33%. Millions of Nigerians are unemployed. More millions of Nigerians are essentially poor. So you can look at it in two ways. Conventional economic argument will be that when you raise minimum wage, you're going to raise inflation. But what we have seen recently, just like how many economists have argued that trickle-down economics helps to expand businesses and wages, and there's been a study recently that the so-called trickle-down economics, where you give tax breaks to the rich in the society, does not really translate to the creation of more jobs. So there are some of these established economic ideas that should be interrogated, and one of them is this argument about minimum wage. Yes, there's the idea that if you peg minimum wage at a certain level, employers would have to retrench people because they cannot pay that minimum wage. But the reality and the truth is, we have to look at what we have in our hands and ask ourselves very few fundamental questions. One, can this minimum wage that we currently pay sustain the average Nigerian worker? 2, does this minimum wage, has it been adjusted to meet with the growing inflation that we currently are experiencing in our country? 3, has this minimum wage been adjusted to the productivity levels in our country as we speak today? Does this minimum wage reflect the reality of the purchasing power of the average Nigerian as we speak today? If we can answer these questions in all honesty, if the elected officials who are paid in 6 figures can come down from their high horses and wear the shoe of the average Nigerian man and feel where it pinches and feel where it hurts, then they will realize that it will be unfair to move this minimum wage to the states where we know that these numbers are going to be beating down and where we know that many governors are still going to owe their workers. It would be unfair to the average Nigerian worker to see that happen. We pay politicians in 6 figures, and what do they do for us? What do they give us in return? What value do they create for the economy? So the people who break their backs every morning, the people who go to work, the bureaucracy that keeps this country running, we cannot look them in the eye and say they do not deserve a 30,000 naira pay. So I don't buy that economic argument of, oh no, it's federalism, let them go back. I don't buy that argument. We must retain a national minimum wage. We must keep a national minimum wage and encourage states to even pay above the national minimum wage, because the reality as we speak today is starkly dark for many Nigerian families.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave the conversation there now. Managing editor, the Avalon Daily, Ayodele Adio, thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.